I'm going to invite Julian Birkinshaw onto the stage now to give us the final bite-sized insight, and he's going to be tackling the broad topic in only 10 minutes of so what's next, the changing sources of competitive advantage. Good luck if you can do that in 10 minutes.
Thanks. So yeah, we spent a day talking about the digital era, the information era, how technology is transforming the way we work. And I am now going to, in these last 10 minutes, give you some speculative views about what comes after that. And by its nature, this is going to be a little bit provocative, not necessarily stuff that you have to believe every single thing I say, but hopefully I'm going to be at least provoking you to think a little bit more creatively about this issue. And I'm going to start with the classic way of looking at the last 100 years of economic development. We had the industrial era. We all know what that was. And we also had, if you like, the knowledge era. We live in the knowledge era. You can call it the information era if you prefer. I'm going to stick with knowledge era. I think Peter Drucker was the first person who coined the term knowledge worker. And roughly speaking, in the 1960s, 1970s, the industrial era gave way to the knowledge era. What does that mean? It means that the sources of advantage that made companies successful, and indeed individuals successful, gradually transitioned from one to the other. It doesn't mean that things that mattered in the industrial era were no longer important. It means that they were necessary but not sufficient. Even today, we still need factories, but that's not the way that companies become successful. So in order to understand how one era led to the other, it's worth just digging a little bit into that period of transition in the following way. Think about your classic economics textbook. The classic economics textbook says that the factors of production were capital and labor. You all remember that from when you were younger. Capital and labor were the things that companies brought together to create value. But gradually, over time, capital and labor didn't become as important as they perhaps were at one point. Capital matters, capital will always matter, but organizations that focused, and let's take the car industry as the classical example, organizations that focused too much on the short-term return on investment, focused really too much on making a living out of their existing capital, they ran the risk, if you like, of missing the bigger picture. One of the arguments that's out there about why the Fords and General Motors of this world gave way, if you like, to the Toyotas and Hondas was because those Japanese car companies were much more thoughtful about figuring out what customers really wanted rather than just, in the classic phrase, managing our way to economic decline. And so information, the power of information, started to become more and more important. And a parallel argument, if you like, existed at the level of, if you like, the individual, which is that if we squeeze our workers too far, if we use the sort of Tayloristic management principles and do time and motion studies in order to squeeze every last drop of energy out of our manual laborers, what do? Well, we alienate them. We actually end up taking away the very essence of what they could bring, which of course is their brain power and their knowledge. So productivity, focus on productivity, actually drove out motivation and gave rise, if you like, to a realization that the organizations which were tapping into the full potential of their people, their knowledge, that was the organizations that were going to start winning out. So very simple argument that says this is how information and knowledge started to take over. Now, let's take that logic and then kind of move it forward to say, what's next? And the argument is, of course, that there is a knowledge era in which we sit today. Whether this has got 2 years or 20 years left to run, it doesn't really matter. And I haven't got a fancy name for it yet, we're going to call it for the moment the post-knowledge era, because it's obviously just by definition what comes next. There must be something else that comes beyond. I mean, I don't believe we've reached the end of history in terms of the basis of competitive advantage of organizations. There must be underway or perhaps coming some sort of transition. And in order to make sense of that, what we have to do is ask ourselves essentially a very simple question, which is, what would a world with too much emphasis, if you like, on information and knowledge look like? I don't think I need to convince you that we live in a world already with too much information. And so that line of thinking leads us to the following hypothesis, which is, in a world where there is too much information out there, what then becomes the scarce resource? Well, it turns out that Herbert Simon, the Nobel laureate, said it best. He said, in a world of plentiful information, the scarce resource is actually attention. It's actually our capacity to focus on the stuff that matters. If we've got stimuli coming in from everywhere, the stuff that we need to think about is, the job we have to do is to figure out which of these stimuli to attend to. The organizations which are better at focusing and attending to the right stimuli will be the ones that do best in the future. So we actually need, essentially, to think in terms of decisive action being a source of competitive advantage in a world where there is bountiful or plentiful information. A similar sort of logic, and a slightly more tricky argument, applies to the knowledge. What would a world of too much knowledge look like? That almost feels like an impossible question to answer. How can more knowledge be bad? Well, the argument I want to make is that if we focus on a slightly more kind of narrow definition of knowledge, in terms of, if you like, left-brain knowledge, the rational scientific version of knowledge, we can think of a lot of organizations which are hyper-rational. They're so fixated on getting to the right answer, what they do is they stop any more relying on intuition or judgment. I made the comment in an earlier panel about Jeff Bezos at Amazon saying we need to figure out which decisions we can make through science and which ones we need to make based on emotion and gut and instinct. And so for me, the logic here says that if we end up focusing too much on logical decision-making, we actually end up making sterile decisions. We end up making decisions which are devoid of emotion. And the organizations, arguably, that will do best in the future will be the ones who are able to tap into, if you like, the emotional conviction of their employees. In other words, they're able to get the entire person out. In other words, the old era, the industrial era, was about using our hands. The knowledge era was about using our brains. The next era is more about using our hearts. Now, that doesn't sit particularly well with a lot of people who are trained in engineering or accounting or whatever, but this notion that we've got to figure out a way of getting all of the creativity and instinct and intuition that we can bring to bear, put it on the table and to use that, to harness that, I think that's a kind of an important direction to go. So that's I've got 2 points to make. I've only got 10 minutes. Point number one is the eras in which we are working are driven, if you like, by different sources of advantage. And for me, decisive action and emotional conviction become increasingly important in a world which has become too obsessed with information and knowledge. So that's the first argument. The second argument is about how we organize, in other words, how we as companies figure out how to harness decisive action and emotional conviction. Now, I want to build on something that Gary Hamel said earlier. Gary made the point, essentially, that our traditional ways of working are no longer fit for purpose. We need to be creative, we need to be experimental about trying new ways of working. I'm just going to give you a very quick thought on what some of those alternative models of management might look like. And I want to do it through the following simple thought experiment. When you went to the reception last night, when you go to any sort of event, how do you introduce yourself to a colleague? One option is you thrust your business card into their hand and you say, here is me, I'm an executive vice president, or I'm a senior sales manager, or whatever it is, as a way of saying that my role is I have a formal title. That's one very valid way of introducing yourself. You can introduce yourself by, sort of conceptually anyway, reading your CV to them. You can tell them, this is what I've done, this is the degrees I've got, this is the work experience I've got, this is how smart I am. And essentially, by telling that person about your knowledge, your experience, what you've done to contribute to your organization. A third model is to say, actually, that stuff doesn't matter. What matters is how I spend my time. There's a very famous management academic, Henry Mintzberg, some of you have heard of him. He made his name by essentially following managers around, watching what they were doing, and he discovered that actually the way that they acted bore no resemblance to what they said that they did, if you see what I mean. So how we act on a day-to-day basis is another way of describing ourselves in the workplace. And then the final way of thinking about this is to say that actually we are all, of course, people with left brains and right brains, with feelings, with emotions, trying to get a sense of who we are and how we contribute to the world at large, rather than just narrowly around our work activities, is a fourth option. And these kind of four are basic, very, very basic kind of different lenses at looking at how we work in the workplace. Now, let me bring that logic back to where we started in the following way, and it's to say that each of these models of management links to an underlying set of assumptions about which part of ourselves we are bringing to bear in the organization. So if you are an organization that essentially thinks that your job title is the most important thing, you are almost by definition working in a bureaucracy. A bureaucracy is an organization which coordinates through standardized rules and procedures through formal authority. Now, there's nothing wrong with bureaucracy. Bureaucracies are great, but they also have massive limitations, as Gary has already told us. A meritocracy is the name that we can give to an organization which privileges our knowledge and experience. London Business School is a meritocracy, more or less. Most professional services companies are meritocracies. Most Silicon Valley companies think of themselves as meritocracies. In a meritocracy, the quality of the argument trumps our formal position. What are the names we're going to give to these other two alternative ways of looking at things? I have to make up some terms here because we haven't got good terms out there. One of them is what you might call an adhocracy. In other words, an organization that privileges action above either knowledge or formal position. You go to a trading floor, you think of a special forces unit in the military. You think of any sort of special tiger team or skunk works in a big organization. These are all examples of units, activities where action, getting things done, trying new stuff is far more important than anything else. The agile movement in software, if you think about it, agile development in software is all about experimentation and trying new ideas. What's the name we're going to give to this last box? We're going to call it emocracy because we don't have a word. Emocracy obviously taps into emotion. What is the concept of emocracy? The concept is that we are building an organizational model that privileges tapping into and using and harnessing emotion and belief more than either what people do, how they think, or how they are positioned. Now, some religious organizations work that way. You can argue that an organization like an Apple or a Harley Davidson works on the basis of an emotional connection to their customers. You can think of an organization like Tupperware, one of these direct selling organizations, which has 3.5 million salespeople around the world. When you get to know that sort of organization, you realize what they are doing is they are building belief in their people as a means by which they actually sell their products. Now, I'm not trying to suggest for a second that your organization should tick one of these boxes. The basic argument is that the classical bureaucratic model is gradually giving way, and it's giving way to some combination of these meritocracy, adhocracy, and democracy. And if you want to put them onto the chart that we showed earlier, it's a very simple story, which is that if you buy the argument that the knowledge era was all about meritocracy, and the industrial era was, of course, all about bureaucracy, increasingly the world of the future, as some of these alternative approaches around decisive action and emotional conviction become more important, gradually we're going to start seeing, I would argue, some of these alternative models emerging. What do those look like? Well, again, to go back to what Gary says, we don't have the full answer. What we do have is examples of companies experimenting with some of these alternative models. And of course, they're not radically different to what we've seen before. Many organizations do bits of these things. But the key point to think about when I present a chart like that is to say, each of them is making a different set of assumptions about the, shall we say, the ordering of what is important. And that's my kind of key takeaway here, is we can easily agree that our formal position in the hierarchy, the bureaucratic model, is no longer very important. But which of the other three do we actually find more useful? I would think of Google, for example, as a company which is very much a meritocracy, blended with, to some degree, an adhocracy. A company like Apple actually, surprisingly, still has an awful lot of bureaucracy, a very, very top-down, very centralized, almost secretive, blended with, if you like, pieces of my emocracy. There's a great deal of building around belief in a company like Apple. So that is my story. As I say, the intention is not to suggest in any sense that the information era is history. We will continue to need lots of investments in information and technology. Many, many years to come. Big data and other such mechanisms are very valuable techniques. But the smartest companies don't just squeeze the additional incremental value out of the existing models. they look to the future. They say, what lies beyond this? And for me, the companies that are going to do the best in the future are the ones that aren't just harnessing the power of the knowledge era. They're the ones that are tapping into the potential of this post-knowledge era. So with that, I will finish. Thank you very much.